Hey everybody, welcome to the Pace Studios. We are here today with a very special guest, author Lizzy Goodman. Thank you for being here.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Lizzy's new book is called Meet Me in the Bathroom, The Rebirth and Rock and Roll in New York City, 2001 to 2011, and it is really an amazing read. It's an oral history of the rock scene in New York City just at the turn of the century, as the title suggests. With the Strokes and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and the Walkmen and TV on the radio and on to Vampire Weekend and Grizzly Bear and a lot of the bands that really defined an era in New York City. And we're so glad to have Lizzy with us today.
Happy to be here. It's great.
So I wanted to start off just sort of by getting a sense of who you are, so our readers know, where you fit in to this picture. So like at the time you were in New York.
Yeah.
Mixing it up with all of these bands. What was your part in this scene at the time?
Well, I was in college. I'm from New Mexico originally, and that's where I grew up, born and raised. But I always had this kind of infatuation with New York, like a giant crush on an idea, kind of. And I came to college in Philadelphia. So I was in school in Philly and kind of in the summers, in between classes, I would come to New York and work in restaurants or whatever. My first job was in a restaurant. And through that, I met people in bands. Like that's kind of the sort of undergirding of the actual band community is like, okay, but then you have to go to this restaurant job during the day, or you work at a video store, or you do, especially back then in the analog world. So among others, I met the guitarist Nick Valenci from the Strokes, and we worked in a restaurant together, and through him I kind of got plugged into just this idea that there are like all these kids playing music, and they're my age, but they're in bands and they're kind of good, and like it's really fun to go and see them play, and just to sort of that introduced me to the world of being a kid in a city, whether that was Philadelphia where I was in school or kind of coming to and from New York whenever I could to see bands up here too.
And amazingly at that time, this was like a kind of a unique thing. I mean, New York had been kind of musically dormant for years,
Yes.
And you arrive at this time where you might think, coming from another place, like, well, this is just New York. New York just constantly has a million bands.
Totally,
all
yeah.
these kids, but it actually wasn't. This was like something that was new happening in the city.
Yeah, I mean, it's really almost unimaginable at this point, but it was like, there's some line in the book that I just love. I think it's from one of the guys in Jonathan Fire Eater and later the Walkmen, but where it's sort of like, listen, being in a band in like the late 90s was like the worst thing you could do to your friends. It was like, please God, don't make me, I have to see your band play, like, or, that's like a part of my social network now is I have to go like support you in your band. Like it wasn't rock and roll, like, leather jacket cool. Like, no, absolutely not. That was not supposed to be sort of any kind of next thing, certainly not commercially. And even in just the sort of like infrastructure of cool and hipness or whatever in that era, it was not like a sexy thing to be doing in the same way that I guess it feels like it is now, or even in the same way that it might have, that people were aware it used to be. Like it was like you could see in movies or TV that people were in bands and that was like cool, but it didn't feel like something you were psyched to necessarily like tell your friends about and get dragged to, which I mean, when he said that, I found that sort of surprising because I did not play in bands, so I didn't know that. But that was kind of the feeling around it. And certainly in New York specifically, the idea of rock and roll as this thing that was going to take over again and that was going to be something that everyone would be psyched on, no, like that was not happening.
Yeah, I remember there was at that time there was a sense that the dance music that had been sort of taking over England and Europe was going to come here, and we were all just going to get into dance music.
Totally.
And then for people like myself also who were, came to the city in about 2001, these bands were like, well, thank God there is rock music in New York City.
Yeah, I mean, the cultural exchange between the UK and the US is, well established, and I think that at the time those in the industry, both the magazine, like the publishing industry and the music industry itself, were sort of waiting for the US, or expecting or somehow anticipating that the US would have a UK-like dance craze moment, right. Where everyone would be, like hanging out in fields doing ecstasy and listening to Orbital or something like that. And that was not, I mean, it's really, I don't, to answer the question of why that continues to not be what Americans want to do is like a really, I don't know the answer to that. There are plenty who have posited suggestions about why that is, theories about why that is, but it didn't happen.
Yeah.
But it was expected to. And it's also important to remember that like Moby had just had a huge record here. Like the Prodigy were making an impact in the U.S. I mean, it was not unheard. It was there was evidence to suggest this might be possible. It wasn't like completely fabricated by bored magazine editors or A&R guys or something. So that was kind of the way. And everyone was excited. I understand it in retrospect too, as like an industry trying to take seriously the digital culture that they were starting to to be surrounded by, that we were all starting to be surrounded by. There's a lot of kind of flack given to the business for not responding nimbly at all, or really missing the ball on kind of like post Napster life. But I do think that the kind of desire to hope that digital music was going to take over was an attempt on the business's part to like not be so stupid about the idea that computers would change stuff. Turned out it was like, no, actually, we're just going to like completely decimate your industry, but rock and roll made with guitars is going to be cool again. So it's kind of a reversal of what you're expecting, but sorry about that.
Yeah, well, but at the time, I think, New York was kind of primed for it to happen. This was a time in New York. People don't think of it like the 90s. I think people think of it as when New York was sort of cleaned up and it became very gentrified and high-rises were going up and luxury stuff. But around the neighborhoods where these kids were making music, it was still like as dingy and as dangerous as ever.
Yeah.
And I imagine that probably had a lot to do with the genesis of this group of sound, these bands.
There's a great quote in the book from Tunde, I believe, from TV on the Radio, obviously, after, I think it's in the 9/11 kind of chapter of the book, but basically and he basically says that he thinks that 9/11 kind of pressed pause on what was otherwise this kind of like buildup of energy that was of gentrification energy, of kind of cleansing energy. I mean, people think exactly as you're saying. I mean, politics and real estate are a huge part of any New York story, any urban story, and the politics were, Giuliani and these sort of draconian no dancing cabaret laws, which are hilarious. And he had been spending all this time kind of, famously shipping the squeegee men out of the city and like relocating people. And then, Bloomberg and money was coming shortly around the corner. And so that was happening, like it's happening. And these bands, I think in a way, and Tunde talks about this, like kind of got in under the door. And then there was, because of 9/11 and the way that pressed pause on this otherwise overwhelming force of gentrification and cleanliness and de-dingifying that we now see like epic results of, there was this bubble. There was just this pocket of time from, sort of 2000, pre-9/11 to maybe 2003 or 4, where it was just like the city wasn't sure it was going to recover yet. Like people were saying, no one's ever going to move here. Tourism is going to be down. I mean, it's hilarious now given what we're dealing with like a juice press on every corner, but like no one was ever going to come here again because it's a terrifying place. And for rock kids, that's like camp then, it's like fantastic. Nobody with any money is going to come here and there are going to be no tourists. This is going to be our town, and I think nobody could have anticipated that, obviously, and it was on the circumstances that created that scenario were horrifying, and there was all this trauma for all the people who were living here. Obviously, all of these bands were here and have specific memories of what it was like that morning, and it's a deep thing for any New Yorker, and it was certainly a deep thing for them. But in the wake of that, there was an ability to kind of like move through the trauma of that with kind of youthful glee that wouldn't have been possible otherwise, I think. Yeah,
it's certainly an integral part of this story, that event.
Yeah.
And there are a few things that really sort of occurred right around the turn of the century. 9/11 was one, but also, as you mentioned, like the beginning of digital music, which in terms of like rock bands and the way things had been done, it was sort of like the end of the era of major labels just sort of like throwing piles of money at new bands. And there's a lot of great material in the book about how the Strokes, who are, I think you could say, are sort of the epicenter of this story. They were maybe the last band that was really, lavished with all of these like expensive dinners and plane rides across the world, and what effect like that had. I mean, when I guess it was only a few years later when all these other bands started coming up in their shadow. That's not a part of it. No. And so like, what effect did that change really have on the scene in New York?
Yeah. I mean, an alternate title for the book, or kind of an organizing theme, I don't know if I ever really thought it would be a title, but was The Last Real Rock Stars. Because the whining and dining sort of, velvet jacket, like private jet, A&R, 70s, rock excess.
With no possible inkling that like this would ever not be the way it was.
No, totally. Well, and the reason for that is covered in the book, which is, it's so interesting how the economics work, because the music industry was incredibly rich at this time because of CD sales and all these baby boomers buying records that they'd had on vinyl and rebuying them on CD, and people having money, and just CDs were like $18.99. I mean, it was ridiculous. And Britney Spears and Christina Aguilera, like the Mickey Mouse Club takeover of pop culture, Backstreet Boys. I mean, just oodles and oodles of cash. So you don't question it. And it's sort of like they were looking for the next thing, which is the nature of the recording business. And they did not think it would be the Strokes, but when there was inklings from public consumption that it would be something like the Strokes, it was like, great, because we really need something. And it was like, Napster, just go like sit in the corner over there. We'll deal with you later, because like we're really powerful. And I just, it's rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic for sure.
Right.
And there is something kind of beautiful about that now in retrospect, because it's just like, and the bands talk about this, like they're like, I was just going to take this for all I could while it lasted. But I think in terms of the effect that had is, what you see is that the difference between a character like Julian Casablancas and a character like Ezra from Vampire Weekend, who are separated by maybe 5 years in actual age or something like that, like relatively short period of time, basically the same generation. Those two humans are like night and day in terms of the type of artist they are, the type of rock star they are, what they represent to their audience, what they represent to the business. It's just like they're two, and but what's awesome is it's like they're both generation defining New York rock guys at the head of these totally transformative foundational bands, but they might as well be separated by 100 years.
Yeah, and even in their like aesthetic, you can see it. Ezra, I think, has more of this sort of, the more academic sort of internet age vibe. Julian and the Strokes, part of the romance of it was that they seemed to be hearkening back to like the 70s boom in New York music, like, with the Talking Heads and CBGBs, and even back to the Velvet Underground. Like, they were sort of like the last of that kind of rock star.
Yes.
But one thing I was sort of curious about is a lot of in the book, when these labels start to like descend on New York, where's the next Strokes? Is it the Yeah Yeah Yeahs? Who is it? The Rapture? Who is it? There's a lot of talk about how like we had no idea that New York was going to be the next Seattle, meaning like the grunge era of like 10 years before that.
Yeah.
And one thing that I was thinking as I was reading it was, in Seattle, those bands like the Nirvanas and Pearl Jams and Soundgardens, they became like absolute global superstars, like Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, mainstream beer commercial bands.
Yes.
And the Strokes and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and the bands that came out of New York, even like LCD Sound System and all of them, they all became really big, but they never really transcended a certain like indiness. The Strokes, as great and as big as they were never Nirvana, were never Pearl Jam.
No.
And I wonder if that is, what was the reason for that? Was it sort of the grunge did happen at the end of the label era where labels could just like force them around the world? Or was there some other factor that sort of put a cap on where these New York bands were going to get?
That's interesting. I think I mean, it's so easy to to sort of academicize it in retrospect and act like I have any idea why that would have happened or why that's the case. I do think, but I will proceed
Please
to do
try.
that anyway.
Yeah.
I do think that part of it is money. Like, I think as soon as, I mean, the bubble didn't hold, right? So like, as soon as the Strokes were on this sort of ascension, there was simultaneously a fully sinking ship happening beneath them. I mean, so label reorganization, restructuring, the condensing of these labels, I mean, all the industry stuff that, people know about and is like interesting or not, depending on how fascinated you are by like music business, mechanisms. But that's part of it for sure. It's not a non-thing. Whereas like Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden and all of their sort of subsidiary artists that got signed in the wake of that benefited from a very robust business set up to capitalize on the fact that everyone in America was buying flannel, and it was being sort of mutually reinforcing itself throughout the culture, this idea of alternative cool. And there was just money behind that, and there was money being made everywhere, right? So I do think that that's part of it. And you could say, well, the Strokes didn't sell enough records to support, and I mean, but there's no doubt that Napster happened before the Strokes record came out, and nobody knew what to do with it. And that continued to be like the hugest problem in any room, no matter what band you are. It cut into everybody. So I think that's part of it. I also think there's something really important that Jenny Eliscu, who's a brilliant journalist and sort of historian of all of this, says in the book that I think is key, that really helped me kind of formulate my own thoughts on that question, which is she talks about the difference between like the mainstream and the underground, like the real underground. And that the Strokes, that true, like a true underground artist is not built to sort of sustain itself in a mainstream environment. Like, these are kind of freaks. Like, it's a fringe notion, and that there's nothing, and that doesn't say that, and I'm now, poor Jenny, I'm like butchering her point. She says it much more eloquently in the book, but basically that underground and mainstream, neither one of these things is inherently wrong or right, and that sometimes they can intermingle. But at the end of the day, the Strokes were an underground band, and that someone like Kings of Leon were not. Someone like the Killers were not. And to me, what that has to do with, and this is now more my thought than what Jenny expresses, so I'm not putting words into her mouth, but that I think of it much more as an idea in advance of what kind of band you want to be. So like Julian and those guys, when they were forming their band, they wanted to be guided by voices. That was their dream. They were serious about that. There was no, and part of that is there was no model for all the reasons we've already discussed. It was not a sane thing to say at that time, I would like to be in a rock band and therefore I will be rich and famous and have like a French chalet or something like that. That was like crazy talk.
Yeah.
That was not going to happen for everyone. So partially there was no model, but I also think just as humans, their ambition, despite how beautiful and pop and clean and like and sort of like fully formed, to use that horrible expression, they seemed to their audience and to the industry and to anyone who saw them, that's not really how they saw themselves. Like they saw themselves as a small kind of semi-fringe, they loved Blonde Redhead. Those are the shows I would see those guys at.
Right.
The Kings of Leon walked into RCA and were like, yep, I'm going to be a rock star like that guy. The Killers had the benefit of the Strokes. They walked into to their record label, or they bought Brandon talks about buying the Strokes EP and at a Virgin Megastore or something like that and going, yep. I mean, there was this idea with those artists that such a thing was possible. And there was the idea that that's what they wanted. And I think that's an important distinction too, is partially just desire and creative identity. I don't know if you would say to use your whole comparison, I'm not saying I know that Eddie Vedder wanted it in that same way.
Right,
it's probably a combination of all these factors. But for this scene, I think that's an important distinction.
And it's amazing how, as we were saying, the difference 10 years can make from like 91 to 2001.
Totally.
It's like a totally different world.
Epic, yeah.
So let's talk about a little how you actually created this book. So it's an oral history. It has amazing interviews in it, a lot of them. It must have taken a long time to track all these people down.
Yes.
But what really kind of what always strikes me as I'm reading an oral history is like it's like 100% reliant as you're telling this story on the memories and the recollections and like the visual pictures that the people you're talking to have. And is it difficult to really kind of get them to dig deep and pull out these details of times that, you know, I mean, in some cases it's almost 10 years ago. In other cases, those memories were probably hazy the day after they made those
or
memories.
Or even in the moment,
at
in
that
many
moment.
cases. Yes.
So, you know, how does that work? I mean, these conversations, is it difficult to pull this stuff out of folks?
It depends on the person, obviously. I mean, that's sort of a cop-out. But, like, I did hundreds of interviews for the book. And it also depends on the stage of the reporting of an oral history. So this one took basically 6 years from, like, true inception of the idea to publication. I was probably working on it for about 5 for real. But basically, the beginning, you're casting this net. It's like you go and talk to whoever will talk to you, which is like a lot of the people who are now in here said no initially.
Do they then say yes because you say, well, I did get Julian to talk, so now...
Yes.
Yeah.
Basically.
Right.
And because, I mean, sometimes that's why. That's probably, yes, mostly that. And also just because you're, like, annoying and you don't leave them alone in hopefully a polite way for years and years and years. I mean, it's a lot, you know, to talk about this stuff that happened a long time ago, and these people are all living their lives and making art and don't really want to deal with it. Depends on what mood you catch them and what time in their own creative life. Right. But at the beginning, you're like, there's nothing there, and you have to find these kind of... And I had like a storyboard almost, where it was sort of like, here's some nights or recording days or just basically particular events that could serve as anecdotes to kind of make scaffolding for this. And so you start by just talking to enough people that you get some candidates for that. Mm-hmm. And then I would write them on little note cards and put them on a wall. I mean, it looked like I had a serious mental problem. Like, it was terrifying. I had like a stalker wall, and it would just say like Mercury Lounge, December 5th or something like that. It's like, is this person completely lost her mind? And the answer was yes, I had completely lost my mind many times. But then once you have some contestants for those moments, then that makes the interview process a lot easier, because you're still casting a wide net. You want people's general impressions for the sound sight, feel, taste of the thing, but you can also be like, yo, so I heard that this particular night or this particular show or this particular day in the studio went this particular way. Is that what you, like, can you tell me what you remember? And then that's the fun part, because it's like, no, it didn't.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. Or, yeah, totally. Oh my God, I can't believe he told you that. Or,
right.
Oh, you know, and then it starts to sort of snowball. And that is really fun. And I think, I mean, I've said this before, but contradiction is not your enemy in life, if you ask me, and it's certainly your friend in oral history. Like, the reason I think what I wanted from this book was the truth of how it felt to be there during this time, or to be one of the truth of what it felt like for Albert or Karen or James or someone you've never heard of, not the truth according to fact.
Yeah, right.
You know, it's the emotional resonance of what it felt like to be there, which is inherently contradictory, because this is Rashomon, which I also keep saying, but it's the best movie example of this. I mean, if you and I have a conversation right after this in which we describe, everything we just said, it would be different.
Yeah, right.
It's the nature of memory. And I'm not even drunk right now. I don't know about you.
That makes one of us. And so, like, do you ever get this sense as you're talking, when people are interviewed for a book like this, there's also a sense, I think, that they kind of know that they are like setting the historical record. Yeah. So, are you ever in a room with someone whose perspective is really important to this narrative, and you're thinking to yourself, like, what he's saying right now is not true.
Yes.
Like, I know this is not true.
Yes.
And everyone else I talk to will probably dispute this. Yeah. And so how do you build that in? You just throw throw it all in, or do you try to sort of
when I first
work it out?
Yeah, right. I mean, you do have to have some journalistic integrity as well. I mean, just a bit.
Yeah, right.
I did not print anything that I thought someone was willfully bullshitting me about. You know, like that's in all seriousness. And I early on in the kind of process of putting this out, I heard the word gossip a lot. So gossipy, and it's like meant as a compliment and as not a compliment. And it's sort of like, yeah, sure. And I'm fine with that word. I think I'm like, yeah. I mean, that's how people talk in real life.
Yeah. It's also what people enjoy reading.
It's fun to read. But I guess the reason that I am slightly defensive about that is to do with this exact question. There is a ton of stuff that's not in there. Mm-hmm. Like a lot. I mean, the original first draft was 1,000 pages long. This is like short. My publisher was like, please make it shorter. And I was like, fine, but this is as short as it can. I mean, this is a very condensed version. And some of the things that were left out, the metric I used was, does this juicy detail, however salacious and scandalous and exciting to read, rise to the standard of actually being relevant to my story, which is New York City is the primary character. These are these people that we're hearing are the sort of like participants in telling and revealing this story about New York. And it's about how it felt to be there during this period of time. And so in some cases, really dirty stuff was relevant. Drugs, infighting, whatever. Sometimes that's relevant because it affects a particular band or their future or how one band member feels about that moment or whatever. In other cases, it wasn't relevant. And if it wasn't, it didn't get in.
Okay.
So, and then also there were a couple of people who kind of showed up once the book started to get some momentum reporting wise and were like, I have really dirty stories for you. And I was like, like mostly if someone sought me out and kind of tried to like woo me with the idea of really dishing on someone, I just didn't include them. Mm-hmm.
But you probably
sometimes I talk to them
out,
sometimes
right?
I did. Yeah, you gotta check it out.
You gotta check it out. That's right.
Due diligence.
So I guess the last thing I was going to bring up as a way of sort of moving the conversation forward, or like the story forward. Mm-hmm. This scene happened at a time when we were saying there was really nothing going on in New York. Mm-hmm. There was a real void, and that's what sort of has to happen, right? Like in the late 70s, New York was like a horrible, dingy, crime-infested like rat hole, and that kind of like it creates sparks. Mm-hmm. Same way I think that was happening here in Alphabet City and in the East Village, where in Brooklyn later, where it was just like scary and dark. And so now, people think of New York, rightly, I would say, as like it's been scrubbed so clean in a lot of areas, mm-hmm. obviously not all. So my curiosity then is like, could this happen here now? Mm-hmm. And if so, like, does that mean like, yes, it could totally happen, but it would just have to be in like Gravesend or up like, somewhere in Queens that no one thinks of, or is New York just kind of like, we're going to have to go another 20 years. It's going to have to die down in order for this like to come back.
I mean, I feel, I don't know, but I think I'm of two minds about it. Mostly I think it's the latter. I think that it does have to die out before it can regenerate. But I also always feel wary about saying that because I think it's part of the cool thing is I have no idea, and that's as it should be. I'm not 20, and I shouldn't know where I would not be in a position to be able to tell you with any kind of authority what the energy of this city actually feels like in its nooks and crannies, which still exist, mm-hmm. and for sure still exist. Yeah. It's just a question of what's happening there and the particular like serendipitous alchemy of who's there at what time and who's bumping into each other at what thing and what their talent is and what their goal is and how does the city nourish that. And that's just magic chance, like no matter what area you're in. So sure, is it possible? Yes, I think it's harder for all the reasons that are obvious, mostly money. Mm-hmm. But I also don't think that's wrong. Like the cycle of trend is this, and everyone's always talking about how the internet has changed everything because that doesn't happen anymore and you can't regenerate in the same way anymore. And I don't think that's true. I think that at the end of the day, I mean, maybe the mechanisms of influence, people, scenes building, which is basically like artists being competitive with each other or being nurturing of each other, that's scenes. Like either it's like, come over here and work with me on this stuff, or it's like, I'm gonna beat you, and sometimes both at the same time. That of course still goes on, because we're still, so far at least, like humans in bodies, like actually communicating with each other in some sort of like IRL way. And so as long as that's going on, that's still going to be going on. I think there are issues in this city, to do with the kind of bleaching effect that money has. Mm-hmm. It's very hard to live here, and it's very expensive to live here, and it's decentralized. And part of this is just about geographic, like you're going to bump into this guy the next day at this same party, and that's going to be a thing, So sure, it's possible, but I mean, every single generation counts New York out.
Yeah.
And then it comes back.
So, and I guess that's, that's like the sort of the final thing is like, New York is a place where for generations artists have come because it is this idea.
Yes.
And is it even possible for it to just not be that idea anymore? Probably
I don't
not.
think so. I mean, one of the things, and this is maybe part of the problem for people who actually live here, but the New York brand is more powerful than ever. Like, that's what the end of the book is about. I mean, it's called Brooklyn now.
Yeah, right.
New York has become Brooklyn. But the idea that inspired me to come here, that inspired so many of the people that you read about to come here, that is the kind of theme of the book, that idea is now known as Brooklyn, but the idea is like insanely robust. I mean, there's lots of people talking about this in the book, but basically that the notion of New York City, which has been sort of rejiggered as this Brooklyn concept, is probably the most potent and sort of universalized as the New York brand has maybe ever been. I mean, Brooklyn, there's a Brooklyn in every European city.
Yeah.
It's like, that's where you buy your, striped shirts and your like artisanal, vinyl records, next to like some handmade candles that actually are kind of good and not hippie-ish, next to like some sort of chocolate, next to like the coffee that's been roasted by the guy down the thing, and you can go visit his whatever. I mean,
right.
That's Brooklyn.
Yeah.
It's just in Vienna, or it's in Prague, or it's in, Brasilia,
So, last thing, getting back to the music, this book is ultimately about all the music.
Yes.
I wonder, as a fan, meaning you.
Yes, I am a fan.
Which were your core bands? I will admit, when the Strokes hit in 2001, I was just smitten for good. And all the other bands were awesome. I loved Karen O. I loved the AES. I loved the Walkman coming out of Jonathan Fireeater. I will admit, at the time, DFA was not as much my thing. James Murphy, I thought, was just kind of wasn't as much my thing.
James burst through the door.
Yeah, I was actually gonna say he'll find me and kick my ass.
He's a very athletic person.
I read his dad was a football player.
Yes.
I think, is that right? That
James
makes sense. He kind of looks like a football player.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So heads up.
What was your the beating heart of it for you was what?
I mean, it was the Strokes first, because I knew them, and I went to and the record. I mean, because I was in a position through dumb luck to have heard so much of that stuff so early, and have been at really small shows really early, and have been exactly the right age to just be like, it was like my friend's band ended up being really good, and that never happens, So I was really fortunate in that way. So them for sure, because my earliest memories of going to shows, I mean, well before I ever imagined I would be writing about any of this or writing at all. Like, I thought I was going to go to law school. Mm-hmm. And my first job when I lived in the city during 2000, like when I moved here in 2002, I taught second grade for 2 years. So I was not a pro. Like, I was a kid at rock shows. But I think the beating heart of it for me, for real, in terms of once I was in that world, what I connected with the most is Yes.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it does have something to do with Karen being a woman, and just feeling like I knew this stuff was for me. I knew the Strokes were for me. I knew Interpol was for me. I mean, as a true fan, I would go to those shows and I would feel found. But it was different to have a girl on stage.
Yeah,
it
totally.
did feel.
And that girl in particular.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not. That's what's great about all these people. Like Julian is an amazing rock star. Like James is an amazing rock star. Karen is an amazing rock star, and they're just absolute value amazing rock stars. Like gender has nothing to do with it. But to see, and that's what I mean, is that she wasn't a girl rock star. She was like just like them, these other people that I was, falling for. But I could really be her. I mean, not actually.
Yeah, right.
Nice try.
But
in theory, it was like,
yeah,
okay.
Right.
And there is something powerful about not being able, it's this identity. How much do we really identify with the people we love on stage? But it's not like I actually thought I could be her, but I did. There was something special about feeling like that was a reaffirmation that, yes, indeed, this is also for you.
Right.
And music is a really dude heavy, like really this scene is very white. And I think I don't want to fault it. This is just great music, and we shouldn't overemphasize like how it's not the fault of these bands that they happen to be white men. It was amazing music that was a very inclusive scene for the most part. But there was something really cool about just having this woman around who was just as rad as they were, if not radder. And all the dudes were obsessed with her and thought she was the best rock star. And
yeah, which she was.
She was.
She was the best
yes.
actual rock star of the whole crew in terms of like being a front person.
Yes.
The style and the craziness, like. She was it. Julian was always so cool, and on stage anyway, very like collected, measured.
Yes.
He would occasionally like, I guess, tear it up a little bit, but
she was unhinged,
right?
And gleeful, and it was just very. You're just not supposed to do that as a girl. Like you're just not. That's very bad.
Yeah.
And I don't even think I knew how repressed I felt by those ideas until all of these artists, not just her, but she was sort of the like lightning rod of an unburdening that had already begun with the Strokes and some of these other bands that get mentioned in the book that never got famous. Like the Realistics were my other favorite band. The Strokes and the Realistics were my two. I would never miss a show. And they had already kind of set me off. And then Karen just pushed me right over the edge.
Yeah.
No more law school. No more teaching second grade. I was like, bye.
And here we are today.
Talking
about this.
Yes.
That's right. Which is a great segue to congratulations on the book. It's an amazingly fun read.
Thank you.
Everyone should go out and get this book. If you love rock music, if you love New York, even if you don't, it's just really fun, and it's really juicy, and it's got incredible information in it and a lot of history. And I'm going to start reading it again. So, Lizzy Goodman, thank you so much for coming to Paste and talking with us today.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Come on back anytime.
I'd love to. Love to.